We're on DAF Samach Vav Amud Aleph. Thank you very much. And yesterday we had gotten up to the Mishnah. We went through the Mishnah. The Mishnah, of course, the theme of the entire parak is talking about Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos. The Mishnah says that you are allowed to do the avoda of Erev Pesach of the Korban Pesach. However, there are certain limitations. Only the shechita is permitted, and then other behaviors, other actions are not permitted over the course of the avoda. Tana Rabbanan. The Brisa says, Halacha zunis alma mi b'nei Beseira. B'nei Beseira were the Nesiim in the generation that led up to Hillel becoming the Nasi. And this halacha as to what to do when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos was forgotten. Pam echas chalar bas alios b'Shabbos shachachu v'lo yadu in Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav. So 1 year during their reign, Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, and they forgot whether or not the Korban Pesach is dochas Shabbos or not. Amru klum yesh adam sheyodea in Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav. So they said, is there anyone here that knows the halacha? So Amru lahem adam echad yesh sha'olam yibavel v'hillel abavli shemo sheshimesh shnei gedolei hador shemaya vav talyon. So a group of people had known about Hillel. They said there's this great sage who came to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel, and he studied under Shemaya Nav Talyon, v'yodeim Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav, and he will be able to answer this question whether or not you can bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. So Sholchu v'karulo, so they summoned him, and Amrulo klum ato yodeim Pesach dochas Shabbos imlav, and they said to him, do you know? Can you tell us if the Korban Pesach is dochas Shabbos or not? So Amar lahem v'chi Pesach echad yesh lanu b'shana shedochas haShabbos v'lo harbe yoser mimasayim pesachim yesh lanu b'Shabbos shedochas haShabbos. So he was really speaking to them almost in riddles, but he was basically saying, he said, look, you think there's only one Korban Pesach that overrides Shabbos a year? There's over 200 Pesachs that override Shabbos a year. What does he mean to say? 200 Karbanos that are exactly analogous to the Korban Pesach that so evidently override Shabbos. He's referring to the Karbanos that we bring on every Shabbos. There are approximately 50 Shabbosos a year, and over Shabbos you bring 2 Korban Tamids, you bring 2 Korban Musafs for Shabbos, so that overrides Shabbos. And as we'll see, Hillel is going to demonstrate that whatever applies to the Korban Tamid also applies to the Korban Pesach. So therefore, he says, it's not even a shaila. Once you know that you're allowed to override Shabbos to bring the Korban Tamid, then the same thing would apply to Korban Pesach. So Amr lo minayin lecha. So they said to him, where do you get this from that you can make this comparison? Amr lahem nemer moado b'Pesach v'nemer moado b'Tamid. Ma moado ha'omer b'Tamid doiches haShabbos af moado ha'omer b'Pesach doiches haShabbos. So he said to them, well, it's Gzeira Shava. It says in the pasuk moado, at its time, both for Korban Pesach and for the Korban Tamid. So, if Korban Tamid is dochas Shabbos, then the same halacha will apply to Korban Pesach. Va'od kal v'chomerhu, and furthermore, he said it's a logical argument as well. Uma Tamid she'ein anush karis dochas haShabbos Pesach she'anush karis ein odin shedochas haShabbos. He said to them, look, he says, if you don't bring the Korban Tamid, you don't get karis, and yet the Torah allows you to bring it on Shabbos. So surely a more stringent Korban, where the punishment for its non-performance is going to be kares, then surely that should be dochas Shabbos. So miyad hoshivuhu berosh uminuhu nasi aleihem. So when they heard that the halacha clarified so eloquently from Hillel, they immediately made him their head and appointed him as the nasi. V'hayoshev v'dorish kol hayom kulo b'hilchos haPesach. And he sat the whole day giving over a shir on Hilchos Pesach. Hischel mekantrim b'dvarim. And at one point in the shir, he began to criticize them. He began to tell them off, to give them musar.
Who's he telling off?
He's telling off the rabbinic community of Eretz Yisrael. Mm-hmm. The fact that you guys didn't. I had to come from Bavel to teach you the halach, such a basic halacha. Amr lahem mi garim lachem she'ele mi Bavel ve'ehe yanasi aleichem atzlus shahisa bachem shloshim ashtem shnei gedolei hador shemaya va'av talyon. So he said to them, you know what is the cause for me having to come from Bavel and to be appointed the Nasi over you. It's the laziness among you that you didn't properly spend time servicing the two Gedolei Hador, Shemai and Avtalion. Thank you so much. Had you done that, had you taken the time to devote yourselves to Shemai and Avtalion, you wouldn't have needed me to teach you the Masorah. You would have known the Masorah yourself. So this is obviously a Musar that he's giving to them. So Amru Lo, Rebbe, Shachach v'lo hevi sakin me'erev Shabbos mahu. So then they asked him the following question. In the course of this year, they said, what would happen? Okay, fine, you're allowed to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. What if you forgot to bring the knife? See, because we learned previously that the Yisrael can do the Shechita, so it wasn't the Kohen's responsibility to supply the Chalaf, to supply the knife. It was the Yisrael's responsibility. So what if a person forgot to bring the knife? Is he allowed to bring the knife with him with the lamb on Shabbos? So Amr lahen halacha zu shamati v'shachachti ela hanach lahen liYisrael im ein neviim hein b'nei neviim hein. He says, you know what? I forgot the halacha, but you know what? Let's leave the Jewish people be. In other words, let's wait until tomorrow, see what the Klal Yisrael themselves do for those who forgot the knife, because the reality is the Jewish people will have this in their possession, this knowledge, because if they're not prophets, they're the sons of prophets, and therefore they'll have some kind of intuition as to the proper protocol. So the next day, people who had forgotten their knives from the day and didn't bring them the day before, so if they were bringing a sheep as the Korban Pesach, since it has a thick fleece, they would stick the knife into the fleece and it would embed in the fleece, and that's how they would get it there. They wouldn't carry it directly. And if it was a goat and it didn't have fleece, so then they would tie it somehow between the horns where there is a little bit of hair, and they would tie between the horns of the goat.
Can you not use someone else's knife? You can't borrow a knife from someone?
I don't know whether you're... it sounds like, I don't see any objection to borrowing someone's knife, but let's say someone doesn't want to lend you their knife. In other words, the question is, if I'm leaving my house, I'm leaving my town in Western Jerusalem, or my house in Western Jerusalem to get to the Beis HaMikdash, can I rely on the fact that I'll find a knife there or not? And I want to be able to make sure that I'll have a knife readily available.
Oh, there's hundreds of people there. We learned the other day that there's all these people there.
There are thousands of people there, but maybe you won't be able to find someone who's willing to lend you their knife. It's not such a pashut thing, because even one nick on the knife is going to passel the knife. So
they're so fast.
Anyway, so Ra Ma'isa v'Niskar Halacha. So he sees what people are doing and he remembers. He says, "Va'amar kach mekublani mipi Shemai v'Avtalion." He says, what these people are doing is exactly what Shemai and Avtalion had taught me. So Amar Mar. So that's the end of the brisa. Now let's go and analyze the brisa. Nemar moado b'Pesach v'nemar moado b'Tamid. Ma moado homer b'Tamid doiches haShabbos, af moado homer b'Pesach doiches Shabbos. So this was the argument that Hillel had made. He says it's Gzeira Shava from the word moado to the word moado. Just like moado by Korban Tamid is doiches Shabbos, so too from the same word moado teaches me that Korban Pesach is doiches Shabbos. Frek the Gemara, the Tamid gufim in olin to doiches Shabbos. How do you know that the Korban Tamid overrides Shabbos? Ilay mimishum dichsiv be b'moado. It can't be from the word moado, because Pesach nami haksiv be moado. So because by Korban Pesach we have this very same word, and if you weren't clear that Korban Pesach is doiches Shabbos, it's obviously because moado at this point in your thinking is not an indicator. Ela moado lo mashmalei hachanami moado lo mashmalei. So just like by the word moado in your original thinking does not indicate that it's doiches Shabbos, you can't use that to tell you that it's the Korban Tamid is doiches Shabbos.
Say with every Gzeira Shava. You can ask that question every Gzeira Shava.
Well, the source text you have to know. How do you know the halach is this way by A in order to apply it to B?
Right.
Usually it's written in the pasuk. So the Gemara's question is, where do you see in the pasuk that the Korban Tamid is doiches Shabbos?
Mo'adah says learn it out from Mo'adah.
No, but the Gemara says you can't learn it out from Mo'adah.
Because you say if you don't know by Pesach, how do you know by Shabbos? That's the shayla.
No, then you don't need a Gzeira Shava. If the word Mo'adah teaches you that it's doiches Shabbos, then what do you need a Gzeira Shava for? You have the word Mo'adah written by Pesach itself.
Right.
So clearly that can't be the word in itself to teach you that it's doiches Shabbos, because if it's
it would be like
then what do you need a Gzeira Shava for?
Just same din like Shabbos, so you don't need to. So
it's the same.
You wouldn't need to come on to Gzeira Shavim.
Yeah. So Ela Amar Kra Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato Elalas Atamid Michlal Ola Detamid Kareva b'Shabbos. That the answer is that we have a different explicit pasuk. It's not b'moado, but rather it says you shall offer the Ola of Shabbos on Shabbos, in addition to the Olas HaTamid. So it sounds, you see from this pasuk that the Korban Tamid was offered on Shabbos, and the Korban of Shabbos was offered in addition to the Korban Tamid. So now that I know that the Korban Tamid was offered on Shabbos, I apply the Gzeira Shava of Moado to Korban Pesach as well. Amar Mar, so let's now go on to the next part. Ve'od kal v'chomer. So Hillel had made a kal v'chomer in addition to the Gzeira Shava. He said, look, the Korban Tamid is not as strict or is not as stringent as Korban Pesach, because if you don't do it, you don't get kares. If that's Doicha Shabbos, then surely a Korban for whose non-performance you get kares, surely it should be Doicha Shabbos. So Ikal Mifrach Mala Tamid Shekain Tadir V'Koliol. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, you can ask a logical pircha, a logical challenge to that kal v'chomer, that there are two stringencies that the Korban Tamid possesses that the Korban Pesach does not. Number one, it's done with regularity, it's done every single day, and maybe that makes it more important. And number two, it's completely burned to Hashem, whereas the Korban Pesach is not. So maybe those 2 points, that it's Hadir and Kolil, make it more important and allow it to override Shabbos, which would not be true by Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, you're right. Kal v'chomer amarlahu bereisha uparchuha v'hadar amarlahu gzeira shava. You have to really reverse the order of the narrative in the Mishnah, in the Brisa. It's not that he first gave them a gzeira shava and then he gave them a kal v'chomer. First he gave them a kal v'chomer. They refuted the kal v'chomer using the logical pircha, and then he said, okay, I hear the pircha, but let me tell you, it's a gzeira shava. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, let me ask you then a basic question. Why did he have to even bother with a logical kal v'chomer in the first place if he had a gzeira shava? That trumps everything. So ela lididu ka'amar lahu. So the Gemara says, but he was really going according to their position, meaning this was part of the musar that he was giving to them. Bishlam gzeira shava lo gam risu deina dandam gzeira shava me'atzma. Basically, he was telling them as follows: look, you guys never learned from Shema and Avtalion properly, so you never received the Masorah of a Gzeira Shava. That I can understand, and I certainly accept that if you don't have a Masorah, you're not allowed to just extemporaneously create your own Gzeira Shava. However, Ela Kal V'Chomer da Adam Dan Me'atzma we boilachem lemeidan. But you should at least use the logical argument to conclude that it is that Korban Pesach is Doicha Shabbos. Why didn't you use the Kal V'Chomer? That's what he was challenging them with. So Amrulei Kal V'Chomer Prichahu. They said to him, because that logic can be refuted, and that's why we didn't use that Kal V'Chomer. So Taka, even though he was trying to give them musar for not applying logic, they had a good answer for that one. Okay, Omar Mar. Let's go on to the next part. So that the next day, they went to observe what people were doing, and they noticed that if a person had a sheep, they would embed the knife in the fleece, and if a person had a goat, which doesn't have a lot of fleece, they would embed it within the hair between the horns. But what about the fact that you're working an animal that has already been designated as a korban, and you're not allowed to have that animal do any work for you? So the Gemara answers, Ki Hillel, that their practice was, even by that time, to do like Hillel had taught. Tanya Amrulav al Hillel, miyamav lo ma'al adam be'olaso, ela mevia chulun la'azara u'makdisha v'somich yado aleha v'shocheta. The answer is that Hillel was very big on this. He didn't want people to violate the halacha of me'ila, of using a sacrificial animal for personal use. So he had a policy, and other people were doing this as well, that you don't sanctify the animal and declare it to be your kachim animal until right before you're ready to do the smicha and the shechita, to press down on the animal and then to shecht it right away while you're at the temple. And the same thing happened with the Korban Pesach. People had segregated an animal that was going to be for the Korban Pesach, but they never verbally designated it as the Korban Pesach until they would get to the Beis HaMikdash. And that way, you'd avoid doing any kind of work or me'ila with a sacrificial animal. So while it was being transported to the Beis HaMikdash, it was okay for it to carry a knife because it wasn't kachim yet. Okay? So now the Gemara says, Pesach b'Shabbos hechi matzi makdish le. But then you have a problem. How can you be makdish an animal on Shabbos? There's a halacha that you're midrabanan, that you're not allowed to change an animal's sacrificial status on Shabbos. You can't make something hektish on Shabbos. V'hatznan ein makdishin ve'ein ma'arichin ve'ein machrimin ve'ein magbihin truma ma'isros. That kolelu b'yom tov amru kal v'chomer b'Shabbos. That the Mishnah in BAYT says that even on Yom Tov these things are usher. You're not allowed to dedicate anything to hektish. You can't make a declaration of erchin, which is say that my or someone else's value is dedicated to the temple. You're not allowed to make something cherem, which is to donate something to the Beit HaKabayis, to the treasury. You're not allowed to tithe. All of these things are considered rectification of an object, which the Chachamim forbade. So how can you be makdish a korban pesach when it's and if it's Shabbos today? How can you do that? So hani mili b'chava she'en kavu lahen zman, avol b'chava shekavu lahen zman makdishin. The Gemara answers no. It's true that you can't be makdish something because the day itself does not require you to do that. There's no time limit to when you can be makdish something, so we don't allow you to do it on Shabbos or Yom Tov. But if something has a time limit, we do allow you to be makdish it on Shabbos or Yom Tov. D'amar Rabbi Yochanan makdish adam es pischa b'Shabbos v'chagigaso b'Yom Tov. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan had said that a person is allowed to declare his korban pesach hektish when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. And if a person wants to bring a korban chagiga on Yom Tov, which was typically done, so then you could be makdish it even on Yom Tov itself. So the Gemara says, okay, fine, you've answered that question. But what about there's another problem, v'halo machamer. You're doing a malacha, a deoraisa, by leading an animal that's laden with a load. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. It's one of the malachas. It's a malacha of machamer. So the Gemara says, machamer kala acher yad. That's okay. It's only a rabbinic prohibition because this is not a normative thing. A sheep is not an animal of burden that it normally carries things, and therefore for it to carry a knife on its back is not a malacha deoraisa. At best, it's only a derabanan. So the Gemara says, so machamer kala acher yad namin he do the isur deoraisa like isur midrabanan miyaika. So fine, but this is an isur derabanan. What right do you have to do that? So hainu dekaboy minei davar sheyesh lo heter min haTorah v'davar shavus omed lefanav. That was exactly the question that the sages had. The question that they were asking Hillel is, we know that normally if there's an Isser D'Rabbanan of a Shvus, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos or Yom Tov. But if it's b'makom mitzvah, if it's to enable you to do an Isser, to a mitzvah deoraisa, can we justify suspending the Isser D'Rabbanan in order to do the mitzvah deoraisa? So Amar Lahen, halacha zu shamati v'shachachti, and that's where Hillel said back to them, it's a good question, Taka, and then let's see what the Klal Yisrael will do, because if they're not Nevi'im, they're the children of Nevi'im.
It's a very basic question, too, not just for Pesach.
I know. It's interesting. We learned the halacha today about shofar. I just said this halacha over in the minyan, is that we actually paskin that we're machmer even by Yisurim D'Rabbanan. If, let's say, the shofar is underneath a pile of muktzah, you're not allowed to pull out the shofar and move the muktzah even for a mitzvah deoraisa of tkiyah shofar. So you have to. It's only mutter al yidei akum al yidei eno Yehudi. You're allowed to do it. But in any event, but this was, this was the standard halacha, and that's what Hillel paskin. Let's go weiter. Amar Rav Yudah l'lagadita Amar Rav Yuna Marav kol hamisyaher. If a person acts pridefully, im chacham hu chachmasu mistalekes mimenu. Im navi hu nevuasu mistalekes mimenu. Then if he's a chacham, his wisdom will be removed, and if he's a navi, his nevuah will be removed. Im chacham hu chachmasu mistalekes mimenu mi Hillel. Where do we know that if you're a chacham, your chachma will be removed? We learn this from the story of Hillel. That this is exactly what happened. What happened? He acted with pride, and said, this is what caused me to have to come from Bavel to become the leader over you guys. So that was a prideful statement, and as a result, he forgot the halacha of what you're supposed to do when you forget the knife. And if the person is a navi, their nevuah leaves them. We learn this from Devora, who was the neviah. Pasuk in the Shira of Devora says that there was a blockade, that it was impossible for Jews to move from one town to another out of the fear and intimidation of the Assyrian army, until I, Devora, came along and was able to provide you with salvation. That was part of her shira. So this was a prideful statement. Uchasiv uri uri devora uri uri dabari shir. And then later on in the shira it says that wake up or arouse yourself, devora, which implies that at one moment she lost her nevuah and she had to be reawoken, so to speak, to be able to re-prophesy. So this is a sign that she lost her nevuah temporarily because she acted pridefully. Reish Lakish Omar Kol Adam Shekoes Im Chacham Hu Chachmas Misalekes Mimenu Im Navi Hu Nevuos Misalekes Mimenu. Reish Lakish in a similar vein says that any person who gets angry, if he's a Chacham, his wisdom will depart, and if he's a Navi, his prophecy will depart. Im Chacham Hu Chachmas Misalekes Mimenu Mi Moshe. Where do we learn about wisdom leaving? We learn it from Moshe. Dichsiv Vayiksof Moshe Al Pikudei Hechayil. In Parshas Matos it says that Moshe became upset with the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers that went out to battle against Midian, and he told them that you shouldn't have left certain people alive, right? So Uchasiv, but shortly afterwards it says that Uchasiv Vayomer Elazar HaKohen Alanshe Hatzava Habim LeMilchama Zos Uchas HaTorah Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe V'Gomer, that Elazar had to instruct them about how to purify the vessels that they had taken from the spoils of war. Why was it necessary for Elazar to instruct them? It's because Moshe was not in the proper frame of mind because of his anger to speak with wise words and instruct them in the halacha. So you see that a person's wisdom departs and they're not able to even articulate their wisdom when they become angry. So you see that from Moshe it was hidden. Im Navi hu nevuos misalekes minu. If he's a Navi, that his nevuah departs from him. How do you know this? We learn this from Elisha. Dichsiv lulei pnei Yehoshaphat melech Yehuda ani nosei im abit elecha ve'im ereka ve'goymer. It's a story in Menachem Bays that there was an alliance that was created between Yehoram, the king of Israel in the north, and between Yehoshaphat, the king of Judah in the south, and between Edom, to all go up against, I think it was Aram, I think it was the enemy. And they all go and they say, well, should we go and attack now? We're not sure. Let's go ask a Navi. And they asked, is there a Navi around here? Someone said, yeah, go ask Elisha the Navi, you can find him. So they go and this group goes, a delegation goes to consult with Elisha. And Elisha, in a statement of contempt for the idolatrous practices of the northern part of Eretz Yisrael, says, if it weren't for the fact that the righteous Yehoshaphat was with you, I wouldn't want to even look at your faces. I wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. This was a statement made in anger. And what do we see afterwards? He said, summon for me a minstrel to play nice music to calm me down so that the Spirit of God can rest upon me once again. So you see that when a person gets angry, his nevuah departs from him as well.
And that simcha brings nevuah.
And that simcha...
I think it's brought down somewhere, not that.
Of course.
No, but it's pasuk regarding something.
Sure, it's brought down in many places. This is the it's brought down, I think, in Orchos Tzadikim. I think it's brought certainly in Sifrei Chasidus. It's brought down. Amar Rabbi Moni Bar Patish Kol Shekoes Afilu Poskan Alav Gedalia Min Hashamayim Oridan Oso. That he says that if a person gets angry, and we'll see what it really means, that if a person has a temper, then even if he's been assigned from Shamayim to rise to greatness, that greatness will be snatched away from him. Minolan me Eliyav. And how do we know this? We know this from Eliyav. Eliyav was the oldest brother of David HaMelech, the oldest son of Yishai. Shenamar vayicharaf Eliyav b'David vayomer lama ze yaradata ve'almi notashta me'at hatzon ha'hena b'midbar ani yadati esidoncha ve'esro livabecha kilaman re'os ha'melchama yaradata. So the story is in Shmuel Aleph Perek Yud Zayin, the famous story of David and Goliath, right? So what happens is that David is sent by his father Yishai. He says, go take some of these food provisions to the people who are soldiers that are preparing to fight the Philistines. And this is where there's this big confrontation between the Philistine army and between the Israelite army, and Goliath stands and says, hey, you guys, come on, who wants to take me on, right? And so David's there, and David's schmoozing and saying, hey, what's going on? Who is this guy? And Eliyav, his older brother, who's one of the soldiers, sees this David, who's normally supposed to be a shepherd, tending to the sheep at home. What are you doing coming out here? And he gets so angry with David, he says, what right did you have to forsake your chores at home and to come out here just to be able to see the exciting things that are going on the battlefield, right? So he gets angry at his kid brother, right? And so what happens as a result? And when it came time for Shmuel to anoint, Hashem told him, go to Yishai's house, and you're going to anoint one of his sons. And Hashem didn't tell him which son it was going to be. Now Rashi says this was the previous pasuk, but the previous parak rather. But the fact of the matter is that we see that Eliyav had a temper. And so that's really all we need to indicate from the story of Goliath. The Kuluksiv lo bazeh bachar Hashem. With all the other brothers, when Yishai brought out the oldest one first, brought out Eliyav. Then he would bring down the second oldest, and then finally there was no one left. He says, is there anyone left? He says, yeah, there's David, and he brings him out. But with all the other brothers, it says, Shmuel looks at the brother and says, no, this is not the one that Hashem has chosen. He could tell that there was not the spirit of Hashem that was indicating that this should be the one to be chosen. Uve Eliyav ksiv, vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, al tabit el marehu ve'el geva komaso ki me'astihu. But when it came to Eliyav, it doesn't say that Shmuel says, oh no, God did not choose him. It says rather that God told Shmuel explicitly, do not look at his great stature and his great appearance, because, why? Because I have despised him, I have rejected him. So you see, Michlal de Havarachim le ad ha'idna. You see that Hashem really did love Eliyav, and he was worthy of being Melech Yisrael, but because of his temper that he wasn't able to control, Hashem rejected him. So you see from here that even if someone is chosen by God to be the king of Israel, but if he has a temper, out. He's out. So that's a very, very big Musar Haskel. Okay, let's finish off. It says, Ashkechan Tamidu Pesach the Dachi Shabbos the Dachi Tu Mnola. The Gemara says it's very interesting. You noted that you just taught us that both Korban Pesach and Korban Tamid are Doche Shabbos. How do you know that both Korban Pesach and Korban Tamid are Doche Tumah? Which means that even if the Jewish people are in a state of Tumah, these Korbanos must still be brought. So Amri Ki Hechi the Yolav Pesach mi Tamid le'inyan Shabbos hachanami Yolav Tamid mi Pesach le'inyan Tumah. The Gemara answers that just like we have a Gzeira Shavet to derive the law of Pesach, that it's Doche Shabbos from the law that Tamid is Doche Shabbos, conversely, once we know that Korban Pesach is Doche Tumah, we can also derive from there that the Korban Tamid can be brought in a state of Tumah. Well, Pesach Gufa Minolan, so how do we know that Korban Pesach is Doche Tumah? Amar Rabbi Yochanan da Amar Kra, Ish ki yeh tameh lo nefesh. Because in the Parsha of Pesach Sheni, which says that if you were Tameh Pesach Rishon, you can bring a Pesach Sheni, it says, Ish, individual persons who could not bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach Rishon may bring it on Pesach Sheni instead. And from that we learn, Ish nidcha lePesach Sheni, ve'ein tzibur nidchin lePesach Sheni, that only individuals are pushed off to Pesach Sheni, but if an entire tzibur, if the entire populace is Tameh, so then they're not pushed off to Pesach Sheni, but rather they bring it on Pesach Rishon. So, Ela Abdi B'Tumah. So, Amar Le Reb Shimon ben Lakish Rabbi Yochanan Ema, Reish Lakish says maybe that's not the correct interpretation. Maybe I'll argue that Ish Nidcha LePesach Sheni Tzibur Les Lutakanta Lo B'Pesach Rishon Lo B'Pesach Sheni. Maybe the correct interpretation of the pasuk is that if there's individuals, they have the remedy of Pesach Sheni. But if it's not just individuals, but an entire tzibur is tamei, then there's no remedy for them at all. Neither Pesach Rishon nor Pesach Sheni. So Ela Amar Rav Shimon ben Lakish mehacha. But rather we learn it from here. The Yishalachu min amachaneh kol tzaro b'chol za b'chol tamei lanafesh. There's a pasuk in Parshas Naso which says that you must send out of the camp all people who are tamei, and it says tzarua, a person has tzaras, a zav, and it says a person who's come in contact with the dead. So the Gemara's question is like this: Yomar Tmei Mesim Val Yomar Zavin Umitzorain Bani Yomer Im Tmei Mesim Mishtalchin Zavin Mitzorain Lo Kol Shekain. The question is, which Tumah is more Chamor? Is Tumas Meis more Chamor, or is Tumas Zavin Mitzora more Chamor? So the Gemara's assumption is that Tumas Zavin Mitzora is more Chamor. Why? Because it's a Tumah that is generated by the body, whereas Tumas Meis comes from an external source, and therefore it doesn't have the same stringency. So therefore the Gemara's question is as follows: why do you have to specify both Mitzorayim, Zavin, and Tmei Meis? Just say that a Tmei Meis has to be sent out of the camp, And once you know that a Tmei Mace has to be sent out of the camp, then surely a Zav Mitzora has to be sent out of the camp. So the Gemara says, why did the pasuk have to explicate all three? The reason why the Torah has to specify all three is because there is a time when you only have to send out a Zav and Mitzora out of the camp, but you don't have to send out a person who had to come in contact with a corpse. Now, even though the Tumah of Zav and Mitzora is more Chamer than Tumah Smeis, but there are certain instances where a person with Tumas Meis is allowed to remain in the camp. And under what circumstances is that? That's when the entire tzibur is tamei, and that's when we allow a person to bring the Korban Pesach and remain in the camp to bring the Korban Pesach even in a state of tumah. So that's our source text to teach me that when the tzibur is tamei, then you're doiche tumah in order to allow the tzibur to bring their Korban Pesach. And once I have the pasuk by Korban Pesach, I apply the Gzeira Shavah to Korban Tameh to teach me that the Korban Tameh can also be brought in a state of tumah. And we'll continue this discussion. This is where we'll hold it for today.